I would say that's typical of a good communist, because Rob Davies is, of course, a very senior member of the SACP. He's committed to implementing and advancing the NDR. And naturally, he has an interest in delegitimating and stigmatizing, using the right-wing slur, those few organizations that do study the NDR and try to warn South Africans about the dangers in it. But if you just try and look very briefly at what has been done under the rubric of the NDR since 1994, one can see that it is indeed quite a scary thing. The NDR really began primarily in the political sphere, because though the ANC won power in 1994, it was concerned that its hold on power was not sufficiently strong. So its initial focus was to really weaken the checks and balances in the Constitution, to weaken Parliament, which we've seen in various ways, so that it's less able to hold the executive to account, to undermine judicial independence, so that NDR interventions are less likely to be struck down by the courts, and to use cadre deployment to send ANC loyalists out into every part of the society so that the ANC can exercise control over what it calls every lever of power. And those levers of power range from the public service, which you would expect, and the state-owned enterprises, to the judiciary, the media, the universities, business, civil society organizations, and even the institutions whose independence is guaranteed by the Constitution, such as the Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, and our so-called Independent Electoral Commission. All, particularly at senior levels, are staffed by cadres who know that their primary job is to advance the NDR. And that has had an enormous impact, of course, on the quality of governance, on the extent to which our democracy is a real democracy. Increasingly, we have a one-party dominant state in which that party is very dominant indeed. And at the same time, the NDR has been proceeding in socioeconomic spheres as well, initially more slowly, since 2012 more rapidly, because 2012 marked the start of the second phase of the NDR, which is supposed to be characterized by more radical steps. So we have had, for example, labor laws, which have increased the costs and hassle factor of employment and are a major reason why we now have such a crisis of unemployment in the country, with almost 75% of people between the ages of 16 and 24 unable to find work. It's also very much used the race divisions in the country, which it's exacerbated through employment equity and BEE rules on the basis that this will provide redress for past wrongs. But what it has in fact done is to cripple the efficiency of the public service, to undermine that of the private sector, and to push up many of the costs of providing public goods and services, because state tenders in particular have become tainted by corruption and inflated prices, as we can talk about in due course. What they've also done, and this has been critical to the NDR right from the start, is to undermine property rights. And this has been done on an incremental basis. And the IRR can talk to 30, 40 policies which have been introduced since 1994, all of which erode property rights, particularly in the land reform sphere, but increasingly affecting other assets too. And the culmination of that, of course, is the current emphasis on expropriation without compensation, which again, perhaps we can talk about a bit more in due course. So if you just step back and look at this from the political sphere to the socioeconomic sphere, the NDR is unfolding in very many different areas. And its overall effect has been to cripple the capacity of our economy to grow. We can't attract the investment that we ought to have. We have much higher unemployment than other emerging markets. And that has all sorts of spillover effects in terms of undermining stability, encouraging the kind of unrest that we saw in July this year, and so on. So the NDR is serious. Apart from its ultimate socialist goal, what it's doing right now is very scary for the country.
And can one interpret the recent local election result as a rejection somewhat of the NDR?
Yes, indeed. I think that because cadre deployment, employment equity, Black economic empowerment, tenderpreneurship have all had the effect of undermining the delivery of goods and services, I think there are many communities in the country that are very tired, impatient, angry with the ANC over the collapse of services, whether it's electricity, whether it's sanitation, or whether it's just the capacity to fix the potholes. People are very concerned about the ANC's inability to deliver. The evidence of corruption through the Sondo Commission, and of course, when a small elite has complete control over the levers of power, then there's an impetus to corruption and not enough capacity to curb it. And people are angry about that too. So there hasn't undoubtedly been a turning away from the ANC in this latest election. Unfortunately, not enough to put the ANC out of power in many municipalities. Partly, I think, because people are warned that social grants are linked to the ANC and they will end if people vote for other parties. Also, perhaps because other parties haven't done enough to capture the imagination of the millions of voters who've been staying away from the polls in increasing number for many years now.
And okay, so the National Democratic Revolution has its roots in communism. How much influence does the South African Communist Party have over the tripartite alliance, or specifically the ANC?
It has an enormous influence. Partly that's historical. And if you look back at the figures when the ANC held its conference in Tanzania, Morogoro, in 1969, at that point, there was only one member of its National Executive Committee that was not a member of the Communist Party. At the Kabwe Conference in 1985, you got a similar result, a few more communists, but undoubtedly communist domination. And what we've seen for a long time is that the communists put forward a policy proposal and then the ANC embraces it. Whether we look historically, things like let's adopt the NDR, first done by the SACP in 1962, and then echoed by the ANC in 1969. Let's embark on a people's war to help the ANC get rid of its black rivals inside the country, first already decided by an SACP delegation to Vietnam in 1978, then endorsed by the ANC in 1979. Or more recently, we look at 2017. In July 2017, the SACP held a congress where they adopted many resolutions as to the policy steps that were needed. And in December 2017, the ANC held a national conference where many of those same ideas came forward and were endorsed by the ANC. So it's that relationship which is so important. Effectively, the SACP is the jockey riding the ANC horse into power without having itself to win any seats. But it really sets the tone. So a whole number of the policies that we see now, whether it's the big thrust emphasis on expropriation, whether it's the idea of state custodianship, whether it's the idea of localization to drive industrialization, whether it's the national health insurance proposal, whether it's the pending idea that we should have a similar national social security fund where the state would take control of private pensions, and very much the idea of prescribed assets, that the government should be able to direct the enormous savings which are to be found in private sector institutions and push those into state-run infrastructure projects and other needs of the revolution. All of this comes out of the thinking of the SACP and is now being carried forward by the ANC.
Why is there such a thing as a tripartite alliance? Why hasn't the two parties or the three parties melded into one?
I think because that would make it more obvious what is happening. The ANC, particularly, in the apartheid period, when there was global outrage, naturally, at what was the racist policies of the National Party government, had a great deal of international support. Much of that support came from the Soviet Union and other communist countries, but much of it came also from Scandinavian countries, from European countries, from the US and so on. And if the ANC had overtly been the junior partner of the SACP, that wider support would have been very difficult to garner. And even now, if the ANC were clearly to merge with the SACP and clearly to espouse the socialist communist goal, that would make it more difficult for it to maintain its legitimacy in the wider world and also within the country, because the Institute has been conducting opinion polling now for a number of years. And it's very clear that the great majority of South Africans don't share the radical objectives of the ANC SACP alliance. You ask them if they'd rather have a political party that promises expropriation without compensation on a big way, or whether they would support a political party that promises growth and jobs. 80% say it's the growth and jobs option that they'd prefer. And so the ANC is actually also out of step with its electorate. It's important too that it should not be too frank with its electorate, and maintaining the fiction of these separate organizations enables it to do so.